I was sitting in my pediatrician's office when the doctor looked at my 4-year-old son, then back at me, and asked with a tremor of confusion in his voice, "Why is he exhibiting symptoms of chemical dependency that I've only ever seen in adults?" The cold air of the clinic suddenly felt like liquid nitrogen against my skin, and the medical chart he held up looked like a death warrant for the happy life I thought I had spent years building. Just 3 weeks ago, my life felt like a page torn from a home and garden magazine. Every morning began with the rhythmic hum of the espresso machine and the smell of freshly ground beans drifting through our sun-drenched kitchen in the suburbs. My husband Mark was the perfect partner. He was the one who insisted that our son Leo only eat homemade specialized nutrition prepared by his mother Elena, who had supposedly been a nutritionist in her home country before moving here. "She loves him so much, Sarah," Mark would say, pouring me a glass of orange juice. "She's a perfectionist, yes, but look at how healthy Leo is compared to the other kids at preschool. He's calmer, he sleeps better, and he never throws tantrums. Isn't that what we wanted?" I would nod, feeling a pang of guilt for ever finding my mother-in-law Elena intrusive. She was a woman who moved through our house like a shadow, always hovering near the pantry, always insisting that Leo's organic, custom-blended meals be kept in a separate, locked mini-fridge in the basement. She was strict, cold, and possessed a piercing gaze that made me feel like an uninvited guest in my own home. But Mark convinced me it was just her cultural way of showing devotion. "She's a treasure, honey," Mark would whisper, kissing my forehead. "Most mothers-in-law don't care about their grandchildren's macronutrients. She's saving us the stress of worrying about his development." I let myself believe him because I was tired. I was working 60-hour weeks at the firm and having a mother-in-law who handled all the grocery shopping, meal prepping, and health monitoring felt like a godsend. I didn't mind that she refused to let me help in the kitchen, or that she forbade me from reading the labels on the imported glass jars she kept stocked. I trusted Mark, and by extension, I trusted his mother. The house was our sanctuary. It was paid for with my inheritance, a fact Elena frequently reminded me of, saying that it was my responsibility to provide a stable foundation for the family. I worked hard to keep that foundation solid, never realizing that underneath the polished hardwood floors, something was rotting. My jewelry, my savings, and my autonomy were being quietly siphoned off into family investments managed by Mark, while Elena meticulously curated every bite that went into my son's mouth. I remember sitting on our back deck just a month ago, watching Leo play in the grass. He was laughing, his cheeks rosy, and I felt a profound sense of peace. Elena sat beside me, sipping herbal tea, her eyes tracking Leo's every movement with a focus that was almost predatory. "He's so delicate, Sarah," she said, her voice dropping to a smooth, chilling register. "One wrong step, one wrong ingredient, and all this work, everything we've built, will crumble. You have to understand that his obedience is a result of the discipline I instill. Don't you ever try to change his routine." I laughed it off then, thinking it was just a grandmother's overprotectiveness. I didn't see the way she looked at the basement door whenever Leo started to get restless. I didn't see the way Mark's hands would shake whenever the subject of the mini-fridge came up. I was blind, wrapped in a comfortable blanket of domestic bliss, unaware that the food I was serving my son was systematically dulling his spirit and tying him to a woman who saw him not as a grandson, but as a project for her own warped, hidden agenda. The pediatrician's words in the clinic were the first tear in that blanket, and as I stared at my boy, I realized that the nightmare had been playing out right in front of my eyes for years. The pediatrician's office began to swim before my eyes. My hands, gripping the edge of the examining table, turned white at the knuckles. "Dependency," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and foreign to my own ears. "Doctor, he's a child. He eats organic vegetables and the special broths his grandmother makes. How could he be dependent on anything but a healthy diet?" The doctor didn't answer immediately. He walked to the door, checked the hallway, and then closed it with a soft, ominous click. When he returned, he pulled up a file on his tablet. "Sarah, the blood work indicates high concentrations of a sedative hypnotic compound, a proprietary blend of benzodiazepine derivatives. It isn't something he's getting from a grocery store. It's a chemical cocktail, likely administered in microdoses with every meal to keep him in a state of perpetual, compliant lethargy. If he stops receiving it, he will suffer severe withdrawal. Whoever is feeding him this is essentially drugging him to keep him manageable. The walk back to the car felt like a descent into hell. My mind flashed back to the warning signs I had spent months ignoring. I remembered the nights Leo would wake up screaming if he hadn't had his nightcap soup. A thick, green-tinted broth Elena insisted was vital for his brain development. I recalled the way Mark would subtly steer the conversation away whenever I suggested we take Leo to a different clinic for his checkups, insisting that Elena's family doctor in the city was the only one who understood his sensitive system. Then there were the financial oddities. A month ago, I had found a strange bank statement tucked behind the toaster. A recurring transfer of $5,000 to a shell company labeled Biolab Analytics. When I confronted Mark, he had brushed it off with a casual, almost practiced indifference. "It's for the special import, Sarah. Do you want the best for our son, or do you want to pinch pennies at the cost of his health?" His eyes hadn't met mine, and for the first time, I noticed his jaw was clenched so hard I could see the muscle throbbing. I arrived home to the sound of laughter. It was a fake, brittle sound. Elena was in the kitchen, her back to me, stirring a pot that smelled of metallic sweetness, a scent I had once associated with home, but which now made my stomach turn into a knot of ice. "Leo, darling, time for your treat," she called out, her voice dripping with a cloying, saccharine affection. I didn't enter the room. Instead, I crept toward the basement, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was the moment. The secret, locked mini-fridge. I had always respected their privacy, but the doctor's words were a fire burning in my veins. My hands trembled violently as I pulled the hair-thin wire I had snatched from my sewing kit, a skill my father had taught me as a child. The lock clicked, a small metallic snap that sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the basement. I swung the door open. Inside, there were no organic vegetables, no fresh broths. There were dozens of identical plastic vials labeled with dates and handwritten codes. Beside them sat a ledger. I snatched it, my breathing ragged, and flipped it open. My blood turned to slush. It wasn't just a food schedule, it was a dosage log. Leo, 7 a.m., 5 milligrams, 12 p.m., 2 milligrams, 8 p.m., 10 milligrams, and below each entry were names, not just Leo's, but Mark's name appeared in the margins, followed by bank account numbers and notations of compliance fee. "What do you think you're doing?" The voice was cold, sharp, and lacked any pretense of warmth. I spun around, the ledger clutched to my chest, my legs feeling like lead. Elena stood at the top of the basement stairs, silhouetted by the kitchen light. She wasn't holding a spoon or a bowl anymore. She was holding a heavy black set of keys, and her expression was devoid of the grandmotherly mask she had worn for years. It was the face of someone who had been caught and who had no intention of letting the witness walk away. "You were never supposed to look in here, Sarah," she said, descending the stairs with slow, deliberate steps. "You're just supposed to be the provider, the one who pays the bills, the one who keeps the house running, and the one who remains blissfully, perfectly ignorant." I tried to push past her, but she grabbed my arm with a grip that was shockingly strong, her nails digging into my skin. As I struggled, my foot knocked into a cardboard box tucked behind the fridge. It tipped over, spilling its contents across the concrete floor. Dozens of empty, high-potency medication bottles and a stack of legal documents. Custody transfer papers with my signature forged at the bottom. The room began to spin. I looked at the papers, then at Elena's cruel, triumphant smile, and finally at the stairs, where Mark had just appeared. He wasn't rushing to help me. He was standing there, watching, his face a mask of cool resignation. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They weren't just drugging my son, they were erasing me from his life, and they had been planning to throw me away as soon as the legal paperwork took effect. I had been living in a house of mirrors, and the glass was finally shattering. The air in the basement felt heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and the sharp chemical tang emanating from the open fridge. I stared at the forged documents scattered across the concrete floor. The papers that would legally reassign guardianship of my own son to his grandmother, with Mark as the primary executor. The betrayal didn't just hurt, it was a physical pressure, a vacuum in my chest that made it impossible to draw a full breath. Mark slowly descended the stairs, his eyes fixed on the floor, refusing to meet my gaze. The silence was agonizing, punctuated only by the hum of the old furnace. "Mark," I choked out, my voice cracking. "Tell me this is a joke. Tell me these are some kind of sick prop for a play. Please." He didn't answer. Instead, Elena shoved me aside with surprising force, her hand reaching down to scoop up the documents. She moved with the fluid, practiced efficiency of a predator. "Stop acting like a hysterical child, Sarah. You've been a wonderful financier for this family, truly. But you've always been too attached, too sentimental. You don't have the stomach for the decisions we need to make to ensure Leo's future." "His future?" I shrieked, the sound echoing off the cinderblock walls. "You are drugging him. You are poisoning my son so he's easier to control. And you—" I swung my gaze toward Mark, who was still hovering in the shadows, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "You're his father. How could you let her do this? How could you sign off on this?" Mark finally looked up, and the look in his eyes was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. There was no shame there, only a weary, hollow exhaustion. "It's not poisoning, Sarah. It's stabilization. Leo he's different. You wouldn't understand. Elena knows how to harness his potential. She's helping him become something greater. You would have just let him grow up to be ordinary." "He's 4 years old." I stepped toward him, my hands trembling so violently I had to clench them into fists. "He doesn't need to be greater. He needs to be a child. You've turned our home into a laboratory, and you've treated me like a bank account with a heartbeat." Elena let out a sharp, jagged laugh. She stepped toward me, looming, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss. "The money from your inheritance was running thin, darling. We had to invest in assets that would appreciate. Leo is our primary asset. If you can't see the logic in that, you're more useless than I thought." Assets? I felt a surge of cold, razor-sharp clarity. The investments they had mentioned for years, the ones I had signed checks for without looking, they weren't for the house. They were for this. They had been draining my life savings to pay for the very substances that were turning my son into a hollowed-out shell. "You're going to jail," I whispered, the words sounding cold and final. "Both of you." Mark finally moved, stepping between me and the stairs. For a second, I thought he might strike me, but he just leaned in, his face inches from mine. "You won't be going anywhere to tell anyone. You're stressed, Sarah. You've been working too hard. You've had a breakdown. We've already contacted a private facility that specializes in nervous exhaustion. They'll be here by morning to take you for a rest." The ground felt as if it had dissolved beneath my feet. A rest? They weren't just taking my son. They were erasing me completely. "You think you've won?" I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that was colder than any shout. I remembered the small digital recorder I kept in my jacket pocket, a habit from my years in corporate law, always recording high-stakes meetings. I had turned it on the second I walked into the house, sensing that something was wrong. Elena smirked, sensing my shift in tone, but misinterpreting it. "We've already won, Sarah. Look around. You're in our basement, your phone is probably already dead, and no one is coming for you. You are a guest in your own life." "You're right about one thing," I said, backing toward the corner of the room, my fingers fumbling behind my back to ensure the device was still flashing the subtle red light of recording. "I have been far too sentimental. I thought this was a home. I see now that it's just a crime scene." As Elena took another step toward me, reaching for my arm, I didn't cower. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a heavy metal flashlight I kept on the shelf, and swung it not at her, but at the main electrical breaker panel on the wall behind me. Sparks showered the room, and the house plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. In that moment of chaos, I didn't run for the door. I ran for the one place they didn't expect, the crawl space hatch that led to the backyard, where I had hidden a spare key to the garage and my emergency go bag weeks ago, just in case my intuition about this family ever proved right. The hunt had begun, and for the first time in years, I was the one setting the traps. The darkness in the basement was absolute, a thick, suffocating velvet that tasted of metallic dust and old secrets. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself into the narrow crawl space, the damp earth beneath me clawing at my clothes as I scrambled toward the hidden hatch. Behind me, I heard the frantic, heavy thud of Mark's boots on the concrete floor and Elena's voice, a screech of unadulterated fury. "Find her! She can't have gone far!" Elena's voice was no longer the cultured, refined tone of a grandmother. It was the raw, guttural bark of a trapped animal. I burst out into the cool night air of the backyard, the grass slick with dew. I didn't run for the front door. I sprinted for the detached garage. My lungs burned, but the adrenaline had sharpened my senses into a cold, lethal blade. I reached the side entrance, slid my key into the lock, and slipped inside, locking it behind me just as the kitchen light flickered back on. I grabbed my go bag, a bag I'd kept prepped for months, containing duplicates of every vital financial document, a burner phone, and a secondary backup of the digital recorder's data, uploaded automatically to a cloud server I'd set up under an alias. As I fumbled for my car keys, the garage door groaned and started to lift. Mark was coming around the side of the house. He wasn't just trying to stop me. He looked desperate, his eyes wild. He had everything to lose, his status, his funding, his son. "Sarah, stop! Don't be insane!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "If you leave, you're admitting you're unstable." "We'll tell them you took Leo. We'll make it look like you had a psychotic break." I climbed into the driver's seat of my SUV, the engine roaring to life with a satisfying, powerful growl. As he lunged toward the driver's side door, I didn't drive away. I slammed the vehicle into reverse, backing up just enough to block his path, then shifted into drive and floored it, stopping mere inches from his chest. The heavy steel bumper served as an immovable barrier between us. "You're not taking anything else from me, Mark," I yelled through the glass, my voice steady, stripped of all the fear I had felt only an hour ago. "I have everything on tape. The ledger, the dosing schedules, your admission about the asset. It's all in the hands of my lawyer and a detective I've been working with since the first time I noticed the bank discrepancies." Mark froze. The bravado drained out of him, replaced by a gray, ash-colored terror. You were investigating us?" "I was a fool," I corrected him, "but I was never stupid." Suddenly, the house's exterior floodlights blazed, and a black sedan skidded into the driveway, blocking the exit. It wasn't the police. Not yet. It was Elena's brother, a man I'd only met twice, known for his connections to the city's private security underworld. He stepped out of the car, his face grim. "The girl is a liability, Mark," the man called out, his hand resting on his jacket. "Elena said to finish this tonight." This was the second, even worse twist. They weren't just going to frame me for a mental breakdown, they were going to make me disappear. My heart didn't stutter. It slowed down. I realized then that they were so deep in their own delusion of superiority that they had underestimated me until the very last second. I reached for my phone on the dashboard, hit a speed dial button, and shouted, "Now!" Almost instantly, the sirens began. They weren't coming from the distance. They were already at the end of the driveway. My lawyer had been brilliant. She hadn't just gone to the police. She had alerted Child Protective Services and a local investigative journalist who had been chasing the Biolab Analytics ghost company for months. Blue and red lights flooded the yard, blinding and chaotic. The man by the sedan bolted, but the officers were faster. Elena came running out of the house, clutching the ledger as if it were a holy relic, her face a mask of panicked rage. When she saw the police, her composure finally shattered. She dropped the book, her knees hitting the driveway with a dull thud. It was for his own good, she wailed, her voice high and thin, the sound of a woman watching her entire empire of lies crumble into the gravel. He was meant for greatness. He wasn't like the others. I watched from the car as they handcuffed Mark. He didn't fight back. He looked at me through the windshield, his expression one of pathetic, shriveling cowardice. He wasn't a mastermind. He was just a small man who had traded his conscience for his mother's approval and my money. As an officer approached my window, I unlocked it. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust and ozone. I reached into my coat and handed over the digital recorder, my hands perfectly, terrifyingly steady. "My son is inside," I said, my voice quiet but piercingly clear. "He's been drugged for years. Please, get him to a hospital. And please, make sure he never sees these people again." As they led Elena away, she screamed my name, a string of vitriol and curses that sounded like the rattling of a cage. I didn't flinch. I watched as the doors of the patrol cars closed, shutting away the nightmare I had lived in for so long. The house, my house, looked dark and empty, a hollow shell that no longer held any power over me. The transformation was complete. The victim had been burned away in the fire of that basement, and what remained was a woman who would never, ever be a pawn again. The legal aftermath was a whirlwind of depositions, medical forensics, and the slow, grueling process of detoxifying my son. For the first 2 months, Leo was a shadow of himself, irritable, prone to long bouts of silent weeping, and terrified of the sound of a closing door. But with every passing week, as the chemical fog cleared from his system, the light returned to his eyes. He began to ask for finger paints, for cartoons, for the messy, uncurated joys of childhood that Elena had deemed inefficient. The retribution was surgical. My lawyer, a shark in a tailored suit, used the audio recordings and the seized ledger to dismantle not just the family, but the entire biolab operation. It turned out Elena had been running a high-end, unregulated experiment on children from wealthy families, using parents' anxieties to push performance-enhancing sedatives that ensured total behavioral compliance. The scandal broke in the national papers, and the prestigious doctor Elena had recommended lost his license and his freedom. Mark's trial was brief. He didn't even try to mount a defense. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to exist without someone else pulling his strings. He was sentenced to 12 years for child endangerment, conspiracy to commit fraud, and illegal distribution of controlled substances. Elena, the architect of our misery, was deemed a danger to society and sentenced to 20 years. She never looked at me during the sentencing, but as the bailiffs dragged her away, I saw her hands. They were shaking, just like mine had on that night in the basement. She had finally lost control. I kept the house, but I gutted it. I ripped out the hardwood floors where the mini-fridge had sat, replaced the kitchen cabinetry, and painted over every wall that had witnessed their influence. I invited my own mother to stay for a while. Her presence brought back the smell of actual comfort, baking bread and laughter that had been replaced by the sterile metallic odor of the lab. 6 months later, I stood on my back deck, the same place where I had once listened to Elena's chilling words about Leo's potential. It was a crisp autumn morning, and the air smelled of wood smoke and wet leaves. Leo was in the backyard, chasing a golden retriever we had adopted, a scruffy, unpredictable creature that loved to chase squirrels and track mud onto the patio. He was running, his laugh echoing in the yard, a genuine, uninhibited sound that made my heart ache with relief. My phone buzzed. It was a message from my attorney, confirming that the last of the asset recovery was complete. The stolen funds had been returned, and the property liens were cleared. I was finally, unequivocally, the sole owner of my own life. I looked out at my son, then up at the sky, which was a brilliant, endless blue. I realized that the woman who had lived here before, the one who needed permission to cook, who signed papers without reading them, who thought she was lucky to have such an involved mother-in-law, was a ghost. That woman had been fragile, easily molded by the cruelty of others. But she had been the one who secretly carried the recorder, who prepared the hidden bag, and who refused to let the darkness be the end of the story. I took a deep breath, savoring the cool, sharp air. I didn't regret the pain, because it had stripped away every illusion I had built my life upon. I had traded a gilded cage for a messy, loud, and gloriously free world. I walked down the steps, grabbed a toy from the grass, and joined my son in the sunshine. My past was a locked basement, and I had thrown away the key. The lesson I learned wasn't that I should have been more suspicious, but that I was stronger than I had ever dared to imagine. You can break a house, you can break a person, but you cannot break the truth. And eventually, the truth is the only thing that remains standing.